dissecting the diverse manifestations of populism around the globe. Following the successful conclusion of our Mapping European Populism panels, we have embarked now on a journey to explore populism beyond the confines of Europe and expanding our panel series to encompass a very global perspective titled Mapping Global Populism. Our objective is to construct a comprehensive understanding of populism worldwide, and this will feature monthly sessions. In the progression of this panel series, we have taken the initiative to organize supplementary regional panels, delving into evolving dynamics surrounding populism and authoritarianism in different regions. To write a panel report and share a video recording of this panel on our website or on YouTube channel. These resources will serve as references for scholars, policymakers, and a wider audience, anyone concerned about the contemporary challenges to global democracy posed by populist politics. In the ongoing journey of our panel series, we extend our gratitude to all the scholars and experts who contribute their insights. And with this, let me introduce our moderator and our distinguished panelists for today's very enlightening discussion. So today our panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Maria Isabel Puerta-Riera, who is a political scientist with a PhD in social sciences. She serves as an adjunct professor of political sciences at Valencia College and holds the position of research fellow at GAPAC. She also chairs the LASA Venezuelan Studies section and is a proud member of Red de Politólogas. Previously, Dr. Puerta-Riera was an associate professor and chair of public administration at Universidad de Carabobo in Venezuela. Her research interests are democratic backsliding, hybrid regimes, authoritarianism, illiberalism, populism, and immigration in Latin America. Dr. Ronaldo Monk will be our first speaker, and the title of his speech is Populism and Socio-Political Transformation in Latin America. Dr. Monk is professor of sociology and director of the Center for Engaged Research at Dublin City University, and was a member of the Council of Europe Task Force for the Local Democratic Mission of Higher Education. Professor Monk was the first head of civic engagement at DCU and drove the third mission alongside teaching and research. As a political sociologist, Professor Monk has written widely on the impact of globalization on development, changing work patterns, and migration. Recent works include migration, precarity, and global governance, also rethinking global labor after neoliberalism, and social movements in Latin America, mapping the mosaic. Dr. Julio Carrion will be our second speaker, discussing varieties of populism and democratic erosion, the case of Latin America. Dr. Carrion holds the position of Professor of Comparative Politics, specializing in Latin American politics and populism at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. Dr. Carrion's current research focuses on the relationship between populism, illiberalism, and democracy. He teaches courses in Latin American politics, research methods, and democratization more broadly, drawing upon his extensive experience in survey data analysis and both quantitative and qualitative methods. Dr. Carrion is the author of numerous books and articles. His most recent book is A Dynamic Theory of Populism in Power, The Andes in Comparative Perspective. And he's currently also working on a book manuscript, tentatively entitled Public Opinion and Democracy in Peru, co-authored with Patricia Zarate and Jorge Aragon. Our third speaker is Dr. Adriana Börsner Herrera, who is an assistant professor of political science at the Citadel, the Military College of Charleston. Dr. Börsner Herrera's main areas of research are Venezuelan foreign policy, the presence of Russia in Latin America, and leadership studies, focusing on the personality of dictators. Dr. Börsner Herrera has years of teaching experience both in Venezuela and the United States, and she will deliver her presentation titled Global Power Dynamics and Authoritarian Populism in Venezuela. The panel's fourth presentation, titled Libertarian Populism, Making Sense of Javier Milei's Discourse, will be presented jointly by Dr. Reinhard Heinisch and Dr. Andres Laguna Tapia. Dr. Heinisch is a professor of comparative Austrian politics at the University of Salzburg and head of the Department of Political Science. His research focuses on comparative populism and democracy. He is the author of over 40 peer-reviewed research articles and more than 50 other academic publications, including 12 books. He is a faculty affiliate of the University of Pittsburgh and a regular lecturer at Renmin University in China. Dr. Laguna Tapia is director of the Center for Research in Communication and Humanities and head of communication studies at UPB in Cochabamba. He won several journalism awards and was program director at the International Film Festival of Huesca and jury member in various film and literature competitions. He has contributed to journals, books, media in Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Spain, the US, France, and Mexico. And his areas of research focus on film studies, the cultural and entertainment industry, philosophy of technology, and aesthetics. And finally, the panel's last presentation, titled The Phenomenon of Bolsonarism in Brazil, Specificities and Global Connection, will be delivered by Dr. Victor de Oliveira Pinto Coelho, who is a professor of history at Universidade Federal do Maranhão and a faculty member at the postgraduate program in history. He holds a leadership role in the research group Powers and Institution, Worlds of Labor and Political Ideas. Additionally, he is a member of two other research groups, Peripheral Studies Network and Myth and Modernity. Moreover, Dr. Coelho is affiliated with the Schmittian Studies Group, part of the International Network of Schmittian Studies. Apologies. Furthermore, he serves as the vice coordinator of the Political History Working Group of History National Association for the biennium 2023-2025, and he is a member of the State Committee to Combat Torture under the State Secretariat for Human Rights and Proper Participation with the Government of the State of Maranhão, for the biennium 2023-2025. As a final reminder, before I hand off to our wonderful moderator, we will have a Q&A session at the completion of the presentation. So you can write any questions you have in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand and pose your question in person at the time. I will now leave you with Dr. Maria Isabel Puerta, who will present an overall kind of view of populism in Latin America, and then administer the panel. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I do appreciate the invitation from the European Center for Populism Studies. Very grateful to be here joining you all. I will be very brief, but I wanted to share an outline of what I will be reading, just so we can use our time wisely. This is an overview, as we have in our program, overall assessment of the state of populism in Latin America. I won't go into deep on the conceptual debate. Populism is a widely debated concept in political theory, and we haven't reached a consensus when it comes to what it means in different locations and experiences. However, we can approach its definition by considering the phenomenon's context, typically presenting a confrontation between liberalism and democracy. In this discussion, there are various expressions relating to its nature. Some of it is defined in terms of an ideology, while others see it as a political and social movement. Its characterization reflects experiences in Europe, contrasting to those we have seen in Latin America. However, in political theory, we can distinguish the American experience of populism, as well as a more approaches close to what Laclau and Mouffe have defined, and less prominent views contemporaneously as a socioeconomic perspective. However, we also should remember Gino Germani's perspective of populism as a form of authoritarian domination in response to political exclusion. However, we look at Cosmuth's argument, and we find the essence of the populist debate with a fluid content, where contradictions arise between an identity based on purity versus the power of the elites. I'm referring to the concept as a thin-centered ideology that considers society ultimately divided into two homogenous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elites, arguing that politics should be the expression of the general will. The categorization of populism is not limited to theoretical views, as a more pragmatic view of populism conceives it as a strategy centered on charismatic personality or folkloric leadership, aiming at mobilizing population. It's a flexible concept that can manifest across different ideological tendencies, yet there are some common elements to be found in the roles that people, elites, and general will play. The common destiny is the idea of radical democracy, if we include these perspectives from Laclau and Mouffe, where overcoming the search for a balance between freedom and equality allows the conflictive nature to lead to the unification of plural movements, thereby deepening the radical democracy notion. The populist discourse presents differentiated dimensions when characterizing its opponent. The nationalist vein is a moral argument defending sovereignty. We can find this in Venezuela with Chavez. In contrast, others have an ethno-populist component, like in Bolivia with Evo Morales, unlike the exclusionary xenophobic traits present in some European versions of nationalist populism. In a scenario where elites represent foreign interests, national sentiment translates into an anti-imperialist reaction in Latin America. Moreover, the embodiment of people's power is tasked with displacing corrupt elites and bringing social justice to correct deep inequities resulting from these elites' influence on the economy and society. Thus, we can find in the Juan Domingo Perón experience in Argentina and the Chavista experience in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, the elements that support a model of social inclusion that progressively moved away from democratic forms and practices, claiming exclusive representation of the people to protect them from external threats. In the current anti-democratic reaction, elements subscribe to the discursive tradition of anti-imperialism. However, other causes are present, including the aspiration of social mobilization against the interests of the oligarchies, overcoming social inequities and strengthening the popular will. Regardless of the inspiration, the context departs from the democratic cause, linking its practices to strengthening the relationship between the people and the embodiment of power. The sacrifice of democratic forms is justified in efforts to close a social gap at the cost of renouncing to democratic freedoms. The populist experience in Latin America is broad and diverse. In the region, we can identify an initial stage characterized by the economic transition from rural-based to an industrial one, whose import substitution policy clashed with the interests of political elites representing land-owning oligarchy interests alike in Argentina and Brazil. In a second stage, the advent of neoliberalism brought a renewed political class. Peru and Argentina are emblematic cases that, under the promise of reducing poverty, adopted the premises of the Washington Consensus to correct economic distortions by applying so-called shock therapies that, far from closing gaps, deepened the difficulties of the most vulnerable and neglected sectors. In the third stage, we find the return of leftist populism with Chavismo in Venezuela, marking the beginning of a phase of democratically elected governments with a clear anti-imperialist and radical left-wing affiliation, initially Bolivia and Venezuela, whose central argument is the rejection of neoliberal reform policies and the rescue of the people as a political actor. The pink tide exposed the populist practice in its authoritarian variant in the cases of Hugo Chavez and Daniel Ortega, while in the past, Alberto Fujimori, and now Nayib Bukele and Javier Milei represent the authoritarian right-wing version of Latin American populism. If anything, the malleability of populism has clearly shown its capacity to adapt regardless of whether it's a right or left-wing movement. Unlike the economic boom period that accompanied Chavismo in Venezuela and its expansive wave across the region, today, these expressions turned into closed authoritarianism, along with Nicaragua. They are facing deep economic financial crises. However, their appeal remains such that they manage to impose themselves in volatile contexts like El Salvador or Argentina, whether due to the need to secure safety at any price or the bankruptcy left by left-wing populism. Finally, populism survives both in democratic and authoritarian environments. The causes that invite its appearance range from the weakness of party systems to the recurrence of economic financial crises that deepen the social gap. The sentiment fueling populism can be vindictive or retaliatory. Democracy is seen as a utilitarian means if it allows for the rise, the access to power, but there's no loyalty towards its institution nor trust in its principles. In the Latin American political tradition, populism has been an omnipresent experience that will continue to transform to attract those disillusioned by democracy and its shortcomings. Okay, so now I will continue with our program. We have next Dr. Ronaldo Monk, who is going to present populism and social political transformation in Latin America. The floor is yours. And you have
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen. You see it now? Yeah?
We can see it. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Maria, for that introduction. Thank you, Luca, as well, for the previous introduction, and of course to Bulent for organizing this event. I'm from Argentina, but as you may have gathered from my accent, I've lived in Ireland for a long time, since the 1976 coup, in fact. But I retain a foot in both camps, here and there. I wanted to talk in general terms about populism, I think following on from that last chat, and see what we can make of recent theories, and see what we still need to do in terms of research. From my point of view, populism has become a very overused term, and it's actually quite confusing from a political science point of view. It covers authoritarian, nativist, right-wing politicians to those on the left who are looking for social transformation. I think what's clear is that the dominant discourse, if you want, in the North Atlantic, link between the US and Europe, is that populism is a bad thing, if you want to put it that way. Most people in these climates think of Trump, they think of Le Pen, they think of Nigel Farage in Britain, and so on. But why in Latin America is it so different? And can we in fact use the same term to describe what are very different ideologies and very different ways of emerging, of involving themselves in the political process? So finally there, I believe Latin America is a rich and early experience of populism, a valuable laboratory to help us understand the complexity of populism and the issue of whether it is actually something, an ideology going beyond left and right, which we will return to. I see three main lenses that populism can be examined from. Of course, there are many others, but from a Latin American perspective, I think there's the socioeconomic context of populism. And someone mentioned there, Gino Germani, who wrote on populism in Argentina in the 1950s. They would have looked at the pattern of industrialization and the impact that had on social classes. And they would tend to see populism as a transition between the oligarchic society and truly democratic. It was seen as lacking something, it was lacking democracy. The second perspective, which I guess is quite common, it's looking at populism as political style, a strategy for power, how you construct the people, and sometimes the charismatic figure is thrown in and sometimes not. To be clear, many politicians deem populists in Latin America are not necessarily charismatic figures or populists in the negative sense. The third perspective, where I suppose I go along, having studied with Ernesto Laclau many years ago, is the post-structuralist one, looking at the discourse of populism, going beyond the socioeconomic and sociopolitical context to see it as always already constructed as an idea or discourse. And that's the theory. It's not necessarily that easy to put it into practice. what can we learn straight away? Populism is not inherently right-wing or left-wing. And there are people who argue it is. Some people say populism equals nationalism equals racism. And then there are people in Latin America who say populism is always on the side of the poor and the downtrodden and therefore needs to be supported. In Europe, it's mainly seen as right-wing, perhaps, exception perhaps Podemos in Spain. But the main one is that populism is an empty signifier, meaning what? Meaning it can be filled with political meaning by different factions or different interests. So is democracy. We're all Democrats, sure. But what does that mean in practice? We all can give that empty signifier different meanings. Demands and antagonisms exist in society, with any given society, and they can be formed in two ways, a transformist way or progressive. And by transformist here, I mean the Gramscian sense that the ruling classes sometimes take on radical thinking so as to disable it. So, for example, some people would argue that the Partido dos Trabalhadores in Brazil, the Lula's discourse, is a transformist one. It appears radical, but in fact, it's preventing, if you want, socialist antagonism. I'm not saying accept it, but that's just the way the theory goes. So for Ernesto Laclau, it's very much populism has no referential unity. It's simply a way of constructing politics. It doesn't have to be one thing or another. It's a way of doing politics and of constructing the people. And Marie Le Pen constructs the people in France the same as perhaps Podemos does in Spain. They're all constructing a real or a mythical understanding of who the people is, who faced the elites. In Le Pen's case, it's the belief that liberal internationalists, globalists are conspiring against the good French people. So you have to pull out of the EU and so on and so forth. In Podemos, it's a more democratic understanding of nationalism. But you can see what Ernesto is going to there in the sense that they're quite similar. Really, we have two populisms in Latin America. I'm sure the other speakers will come back to it. I see Perón mentioned there in one of the slides, and Javier Milei, of whom the least said the better. But anyway, we will talk about Milei. I'm sure we will. Arditi, who criticizes Laclau, says that populism arises as a result of crisis. So it's always a crisis of representation, a response to incapacity of elites to respond to people's concerns. And that was very much the case in the 1930s and the emergence of Peronism in 1944-45. So what is the current wave of populism since 2000? Maybe it's responding to the lost decade of the 1980s. Maybe it's responding to the neoliberal hegemony of the 1990s and the social response by social movements and so on. So it is the crisis I said there, really, of 1930, and that created the conditions for the classic populisms, if you want to call it that, and it really is. It's Perón, Getulio Vargas, and to some extent Cárdenas in Mexico. It was, and perhaps some reflections in Colombia with Gaitán. Since then, since that classical period, the Cuban Revolution occurred in 1959, of course, and I think the previous compromise state that had served so well for the ruling classes began to fall apart. So I think from now on out, you have a populism from above and a populism from below. And I think current events can be looked at in those terms. So is Chavismo populism from above? Chavez came from nowhere, created a political movement, or is it populism from below? It's probably a bit of both. Certainly in Argentina, after the crisis of 2001, a reinvigorated Peronism came in to power, but it was also based on considerable social mobilization. Can one of you tell me how long I've got? I can't see my clock here.
Yes, you have 1 minute, 40 seconds.
One.
Yeah. Yes.
I probably want a little bit more.
Or if you're going to need more, yeah.
Yeah, okay, but no, but I take your point. So the 1990s are neo-populists. We'll skip that. Neo-populism, I think, is an aberration. I think I'd go straight to sort of post-populism then now. So there's the classic populism, there's the contemporary populism, and then where does that leave us theoretically? For me, there are two options. With Ernesto Laclau's work, we can go back. This is the 2005 book on populism. We can go back to his early 1977 theory of populism in his first book, and really look at bringing Gramsci back into the equation, because I think what Ernesto lost, partly through his engagement with Kirchnerismo in Argentina, was that understanding of hegemony. The way subaltern classes construct an alternative to the dominant order, and to some extent, he sort of went along with the populist tide. So, for example, he would argue that the Kirchners, there was no reason why under democracy you couldn't renew your mandate over and over again, whereas a lot of people in Latin America would have believed that 2 mandates perhaps is sufficient. And Evo Morales got into trouble precisely because he wanted to override that principle. So going back to Gramsci, bringing hegemony back in is one option, and I will then finish briefly. On the other hand, and this is what I've been exploring with the Lacanian sort of psychoanalytic conception of populism. It would look at the structuring of the signifiers, the famous empty signifiers of Laclau's, the compromised discourse that defines society for us, the symbolic and the imaginary aspects of discourse, and what enables challenges and changes. So it would go deep into that. Look at how identification, interpolation loops work. What role does desire, affect, and emotion play in this interpolation? Because all populisms are riven through with desire and emotion of different types. Like Make America Great is a very classic emotive play on people's politics. So we can draw the consequences and then more clearly define what's the difference between left and right, how popular enthusiasm and effect is carried out, and the whole truth versus post-truth, the question of leadership, populism and nationalism, and the relationship between populism and the political parties. So that's me for now. I will close off and stop sharing and hand back to you. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have next Dr. Julio Carrion. He will be presenting Varieties of Populism and Democratic Erosion, the Case of Latin America. All yours. 10 minutes.
Maria, sorry for intervention, but we have 15 minutes for panelists.
15?
Yeah.
Okay, 15 minutes. I'm sorry.
So, Ronaldo, we owe 5 minutes for you. You can use at the end of the...
Okay. 10 and then 5 additional. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the microphone.
Yeah, so I'm going to, okay. Can you see the presentation? Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
Yes.
Well, thank you for the invitation at the European Center for Populism Studies. It's a pleasure to be here this morning here in the United States, afternoon over there, with all of you. And what I'm going to do basically is talk about the relationship between populism and democracy in Latin America in the age of the third wave of democratization. So unlike the presentation from Professor Monk that sort of offered a historical overview of populism in Latin America, I'm going to focus on populism after basically 1979, which is, usually we consider the year where, the presidential election in Ecuador that opened the third wave of democratization in the region. This presentation is basically a summary of my book on populism in power. And what I'm going to do today, let's see, this is the outline of the presentation. I'm going to start briefly with a definition, because I think it's important to place our analysis in the specific way in which we understand populism, because obviously it is a contested concept. Then I'm going to, outline what is the central question of the presentation, which is the relationship between populism and democracy. I must say that I approach this question from the perspective of the student of comparative politics, not political theory. So for me, the key relationship is the question of populism and regime change, whether populism does lead to regime change or not. Then I'll very briefly offer some empirical evidence of the performance of 5 populist governments in the Andes from 1990 on. And I will, make the point that you do see regime change in some instances of populism in power, but not in all of them. And then I'll briefly outline the theory to explain that difference. And then I close with a 1-minute reflection about how we can see or apply this theory beyond the Andean cases. Okay, as we know, there are a variety of definitions of populism, and I will say that I basically consider there are 2 different ways to look at populism in general, even though obviously there are more than 2. But I think that if we have to organize the definition into family types, I would say that there is one family that sees basically populism as a discourse or thing ideology or a rhetoric, right? And in this version of populism, which has been worked out by Moody and Rovira Caldwell-Ser in several works, and then by Hawkins also in several works, this idea of this definition of populism focuses on 3 constitutive concepts: the idea of corrupt elites, pure masses, and the general will or popular sovereignty, right? And so there is a moral component in which populism organizes the war, in which it opposes pure masses against corrupt elites. And the idea is that, for too long, democracies or liberal democracies have curtailed the power of the general will to enact their policy choices. The other family of definitions see populism as a strategy that seeks and exercises power, right? And Wayland has been the most outspoken proponent of this. Paul Kenny, in a couple of books, especially in his most recent one, also embraces this approach. There are a number of scholars, myself included, that sort of takes this as the basic definition of populism. And in this definition, the key relationship is the relationship between masses and leaders, right? And so we see populism as a personalistic leadership that relies on direct and mediated support from large numbers of mostly unorganized masses. Even though my definition builds on Wayland's definition, I add 2 components that I think are largely overlooked in this strategic definition of populism. One is the discursive, the mentality, because it's very clear that populism has an anti-pluralistic and confrontational mentality. I wouldn't say an ideology. I will use the term mentality in the Lincean sense. And it's distinct, right? It's a very clear way of looking at the world, but also once populism is in power, it tends to have a general distrust of check and balances. It's not always authoritarian, it's not always democratic, it just has a general distrust of check and balances, and whether it turns one way or another depends on factors that I'm going to explain in a second. So what is here what is the debate on the relationship between populism and democracy? Basically, there are three ways of looking at the relationship, right? For some, populism is a positive reaction to worn-out democracies, right? Democracy that has become too accommodating, too stale, too captured by interest groups, by business interests. And so populism comes to provide a dynamism that it's needed for these worn-out democracies. An alternative view tends to see populism as a threat or as an inherently dangerous for democracy, right? And obviously, this view stresses the anti-pluralistic, confrontational, anti-status quo version of populism, and it always see it as a danger for democracy. And then there is this alternative coming from Moody and Rovira Goldwasser that basically argues that, on some dimensions of democracy, populism can be good because it will strengthen participation, but on other dimensions such as contestation or pluralism, populism could have a negative impact. So what is my argument? Well, my argument is that populism and democracy, the relationship between these two concepts depends on the variety of populism and power. And this variety of populism in power does not come predetermined. You cannot tell what the variety is going to be on the first day the populist leader takes office. Or you cannot tell what is going to be that variety based on the nature of the discourse. The variety of populism emerges, is the product of the political process and the shape of populist organization and mobilization. So because obviously the non-populist forces are going to resist the efforts of populist leaders to monopolize political power. And it's the outcome of that confrontation that will determine the variety of populism in power. So my general argument is that there are two main varieties of populism. One that I call constrained populism, populism that is basically restrained or constrained by other political actors, political institutions such as the courts, where you might see democratic erosion, but not regime change. Whereas there are other variety of populism, which I label unconstrained populism, where there is a significant power asymmetry in favor of the populist leader that leads to regime change. In some cases, to hybrid regimes. In other cases, all the way to close authoritarianism, as in the case of Venezuela and Nicaragua. So I'm going to be very brief on this because basically I just want you to take a look at the evolution of the Electoral Democracy Index, which is an index built by the Varieties of Democracy project. And there are 5 populist leaders here, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And you can see that with one exception, which is with the exception of Colombia, once the vertical line signifies the year when the populist leader took office, right? You can see that over time, the nature of electoral democracy deteriorated significantly in Peru, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and in Ecuador, and it remained more or less flat in the case of Colombia. When you look at, two dimensions of executive constraints, whether the judiciary can constrain the executive or not, you can see a similar pattern, right? So judicial constraints are significantly lessened or weakened in these 4 different presidents, Fujimori, Correa, Morales, and Chavez, and then later Maduro, whereas under Álvaro Uribe in Colombia, there was a little erosion, but it remained mostly unchanged in relation to the years previous to populism. Similar story with legislative constraints on the executive, right? A significant downward trend in Peru, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, whereas in Colombia, it more or less remained the same. There was a slight decline, but not to the extent that you see in all these previous countries. So how to explain these differences? Why is that, in 4 cases with Fujimori, with Chavez, with Morales, with Correa, there was a significant power asymmetry, whereas in the case of Uribe, the institutions and political actors were able to constrain his obvious autocratic impulses, because nobody will argue here that Álvaro Uribe was a Democrat by any means, right? He was just constrained. He couldn't do what he wanted to do. He actually wanted to change the constitution for a second time to get a 3rd term. And Congress passed that legislation, and it was only because the Constitutional Court blocked that it didn't happen, right? So my argument is that there is a significant moment of confrontation between the populist forces and the anti-populist forces, and the outcome of that political confrontation will determine whether power asymmetry ensues or not. If the populist leaders emerges triumphant or victorious, then he will accumulate power, and with that power accumulation, the process of regime change will start. Sometimes it will stop as being a hybrid regime. Sometimes it will just continue all the way to being a close authoritarian regime. And the power asymmetry obviously will lead to the erosion of democracy. So what are the factors that enable a populist president to win this key political battle? And in my book, I identify 2 sets of conditions. One that I call the permissive conditions, the conditions that are, that enable the populist leader to triumph, but also the productive conditions, the actual causes that lead to the victory of these populist leaders. The permissive conditions are basically public support, mass support for radical institutional change, and elite disarray, which usually is manifested in a collapse of the traditional parties. But the productive condition is the use of populist leaders of the state's repressive apparatus, and sometimes, not always, societal mobilization, right? And I think that in the literature of populism in the 3rd wave of democratization, we have not really paid too much attention to how populist leaders use the state apparatus, especially the repressive apparatus, to obtain significant political victories. Yes, it's true, we don't see a dramatic mobilization of the armed forces or the police. This is not coup d'etats, with the exception of the self-coup d'etat under Fujimori. But what we see is that in key moments, the use of the police or the armed forces were employed to prevail over the opposition in countries such as Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. So my theory is a dynamic theory. I identify 3 key moments of populism in power. There is this initial moment, which I call the tsunami moment, remembering the famous Fujimori, the tsunami of Fujimori is a takeoff moments. Once populists assume office, because of their confrontational and anti-pluralistic character, they engage in a battle against the opposition and against institutions of check and balances. This is the moment of confrontation, the crucial moment, which I term the Hovisian moment. And the outcome of that will determine whether populism will develop significant power asymmetry, which I call the populist moment, or there will be a moment of re-equilibration, to borrow the term from Linz, where basically things will back, at least initially, to how things were, right? This does not deny the idea that another populist might be elected and this whole process will restart, right? So for instance, I will say if Trump is, hopefully not, but if he is elected this year, he was constrained, he was voted out of office, this might start again, and this might have a new different outcome as it did a couple of years ago. So this is in general the skeleton of my theory. I will argue that the combination of mass political discontent and elite disarray will determine whether a populace is elected or not. If the populace is elected, then the key question is, where do we have power asymmetry developing or not? And if there is no power asymmetry as a result of the political confrontation, then we will have a case of constrained populism. That is the paradigmatic case of Álvaro Uribe. Under these conditions, we will not see regime change. But if power asymmetry does occur, then we will see a regime change, right? So the question is, what kind of power capabilities are used by the populist leader to triumph, to have this victory? And whether it relies only on the power of the state or not. If it relies only on the power of the state or in the amorphous public opinion support, then we have these cases that I call contested populism. It's still part of unconstrained populism, but it's a variety of unconstrained populism, right? And the paradigmatic cases will be Fujimori and Correa, Peru and Ecuador, respectively. But if there is societal organization and mobilization that is key for the victory of these populist leaders, then the next question is, what kind of societal organization and mobilization? Is this a sponsor, or does it come from below, right? If it does come from below, then we have a case of dominant hegemonic populism, of which, of course, Evo Morales in Bolivia is the paradigmatic case. But if the mobilization is fostered from the state, then we have a case that I label dominant authoritarian populism, of which Hugo Chavez and Maduro are example. All cases of contested populism and dominant populism are varieties or sub-varieties of unconstrained populism. They all lead to regime change. Some cases, hybrid regimes, as in the case of Correa and Fujimori, but in some cases, to close authoritarianism, as in the case of Venezuela. Okay, and this is my last one, right? So how can expand this theory to the cases beyond the Andes? I will argue that in Latin America and in the Americas in general, we have seen cases of constrained populism where, there is a populist leader that comes to office, and for a number of reasons or factors, they are constrained by actors, right? The first, Alan Garcia in Peru, 1985, 1990, Collor de Mello in Brazil, he was impeached by Congress, Menem and the Kirchners in Argentina, and obviously Donald Trump in the United States, right? So those were cases of constrained populism where one can make an argument that democracy had some degree of erosion, but it will be difficult to argue that there was a regime change, right? Whereas we also see cases of unconstrained populism in Latin America and beyond Latin America, where we clearly see a significant erosion of democracy. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Bukele in El Salvador, and that's my presentation. I think, yeah, a little bit more than.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. So let's continue with our program. We have now Dr. Adriana Berzner Herrera, and she is going to present global power dynamics and authoritarian populism in Venezuela. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. I hope that you can hear me and you can see my slide. Hello, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this excellent regional panel. I want to first thank Dr. Bullen Kennis for the invitation and the other panelists, of course, for sharing their ideas and research on populism in Latin America. As you can tell from my title, the title of my presentation, I'm going to not only discuss the case of Venezuela and following on what Julio mentioned about unconstrained populism. My presentation is going to pretty much walk you through how Venezuela became just a radical populist country, and how that radical populism led to authoritarian populism in Venezuela today. So I consider authoritarian populism a governance style that combines elements of two worlds, the authoritarian world and the populist world. On the one hand, you have the classical, strong, personalist, populist leader who sees himself as a representation of the people's will, which is mostly anti-establishment and seeks to divide people into groups by using the us versus them distinction. Now, those who are authoritarian populists progressively and systematically seek to consolidate power by undermining democratic institutions and norms. Also, authoritarian populists employ divisive rhetoric and promote nationalist and nativist policies, and also reject pluralism systematically by attacking, for example, the media and political opponents, and concentrate power in the hands of one leader or ruling party that usually the same leader, of course, has created. Populism is not new and is chameleonic. This is particularly true when we look at populism in Argentina from the 1930s until now with Javier Milei. Also, we have seen over time that authoritarian populism has emerged not only in one country or even in a specific region like Latin America, but also has extended worldwide, as we saw with Julio's presentation, to parts of Asia, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere. In places where populism has become authoritarian, is because checks and balances of democratic governance have been undermined. Rights and freedoms of individuals and groups have been restricted, and a single leader or ruling party has centralized power in their hands. As happens with classical populism, authoritarian populism is not bound to a political ideology, as it was referred before. It's not only about the left or is only about the right. Rather, authoritarian populism and populism as a whole appear to exist within thin and thick ideologies ranging from the extreme right to the extreme left. I'm talking about these distinctions because I also want to introduce my main argument about Venezuela. That is, populism in Venezuela since the mid-2000s has not been only about the construction of the other or a phenomenon that is solely or purely domestic. Populism has been studied mostly as a national phenomenon, but today populism cannot be understood in isolation from global dynamics like the rise of China or the relevance or lack of the US has today in various parts of the world. Hugo Chavez, for example, initiated a form of populism that was not isolationist. Rather, he actively engaged in various forms of regional and international cooperation that later on, with Maduro, have been extremely relevant for his survival in power and for authoritarianism to flourish in Venezuela. In using both a populist discourse and a populist approach to domestic affairs, but also taking advantage of the polarizing international dynamics between the West and non-Western world, Chavez actually was able to not only capitalize on that, but to pave the way to erode democracy in Venezuela. As we know, populism is not a new phenomenon in Latin America, certainly is not new in the case of Venezuela. However, the political landscape of Venezuela has significantly changed over the past 2 decades, evolving from a populist democracy in the 20th century to an increasingly authoritarian regime and populism in the 21st century. In 1999, Hugo Chavez emerged as a charismatic leader, or before in 1998, 1997, he emerged as a charismatic leader with a very populist platform and discourse, which, like any other populist, polarized Venezuelans into the morally pure people, the in-group, and the corrupt traditional political and economic elite of the past, which of course was the out-group. His leadership emerged as a reaction to neoliberal policies implemented in Venezuela, Latin America, and elsewhere, as well as a reaction to the party system and political and economic elites of the past in Venezuela. He offered the idea of popular sovereignty embodied in his leadership. Chavez launched, for example, several social plans and programs, changed state institutions, and sponsored the drafting of a new constitution in 1999 that actually expanded later on his presidential powers. As we all know, he enjoyed great support at the domestic and international level, which helped him sustain himself in power until he died in 2013. As some authors claim, like Kessler and Latouche, Chavez didn't use populism just as an outsider strategy of mobilization. Chavez turned it into the guiding principle of his government and established a regime marked by extreme personalism, continuous mobilization, and direct rule. He used actually his charisma and high levels of support at the domestic level to win elections through different mechanisms, including referendums and participatory channels that were created actually from the top down, including the Bolivarian circles and the communal councils. In this way, as Carlos de la Torre claims, participation in Chavista institutions led to feelings of inclusion and empowerment. Yet, Chavez's charismatic leadership created limits to participatory innovation. With these top-down institutions that I mentioned before, and the construction of the people as unitary actors, and one will and interest, actually that interest was not other than that of the leader, in this case, Chavez. He acted as if he was the only voice of the people, both at the national and international levels. It is well known his address to the United Nations in 2006, in which he called George Bush the devil, but also because once more he used international venues like this one to make the point that he was representing an independent voice, that he was representing the dignity of those that have been persecuted by hegemonic forces on the planet, of course, including the United States. Depending on whether he was in Africa, the Middle East, or any other country in Latin America, he claimed to be the son of Africa, or the son of someone close to the imagination of the majority of the population of the country or continent that he was actually visiting. At the domestic level, of course, he used his TV show and any other platform to also claim he was the voice of the poor and those who have been historically neglected. Over time, Chavez not only created these top-down organizations and groups that allowed him to win most elections and referendums celebrated in Venezuela between 1999 and 2013. He also capitalized on his grassroots supports to find ways to expand his power and those of his loyalists by creating a political party, which still today has great political, economic, and social control in Venezuela. He also constantly replaced his cabinet to appoint true loyalists, attack the media, and allow regimes like, for example, the one in Cuba to have more power in the military and other state institutions, all things that paved the way for democratic backsliding in Venezuela. So his populism was not simply a construction of popular political identities or a way to connect with a dissatisfied sector of the population, but also a strategy for consolidating his power over time. He was able to do that not only thanks to his rhetoric or charisma, but also because of the increased revenue he had due to the increase also in oil prices. That allowed him to expand social spending. Although inflation was not particularly low, also interventionist policies, including capital controls and fixed official exchange rates, benefit the regime and, of course, its agenda. Over time, Venezuelan populism turned more authoritarian while Chavez was still the president of Venezuela. But this has been consolidated, especially after Chavez died in 2013, when his handpicked successor, the former foreign minister and vice president Nicolás Maduro, took the helm of the regime. Even a great majority of those who claim to be Chavistas that supported Hugo Chavez do not necessarily have been supporting of Maduro. Maduro lacks charisma and support from the Chavista base. And that's why, quite honestly, that level of support and that level of popularity in Maduro is not as high as we saw, for example, in the past with Hugo Chavez. Yet, Maduro still uses the figure of Chavez and his ideals as a way to appeal to his base. Likewise, Maduro uses the political party, the Socialist Party created under Chavez and by Chavez, to also purge those who were not loyal to him. So we are going to see in the period between 2014 and 2017, that various politicians that were true loyals to Hugo Chavez actually were purged, not only from the regime, but also the political party, because they were Chavistas, but they were not necessarily supporting Nicolás Maduro. So he used purges in order for him to not only change the cabinet and change all those around him, but also to make sure that those that were around him were actually strong loyalists to Maduro. Waves of protest, particularly those in the year 2014 and in 2017, were a call for the regime to change his authoritarian nature. Yet he not only used extreme force to repress and kill protesters, he also used other methods to secure his survival in power, including, for example, creating an ID card with Chinese technology that registers all your personal information in Venezuela and control those that have the ID, but also receive social benefits from the government. He also have used strategies such as, like, for example, appointing more loyalists to the Supreme Court that, for example, in 2017, took over the functions of the National Assembly after the opposition won the majority. He also created a special force, which is an elite command that responds to Maduro, among other strategies that have led to weaken the power of the opposition, divide the opposition and groups that are against the regime, and of course, to attain the ultimate goal, which is remain in power and have all those loyalists afloat. All these strategies have been implemented in a context where around 95% of the population lives in poverty. There have been repeated protests repressed by the government, hyperinflation, and an economy and oil industry that have collapsed due to mismanagement and corruption. Also, other conditions, including insecurity and lack of medicines, food, electricity, water, and gas, have pushed Venezuelans to migrate to other countries, mostly within Latin America. And on top of that, you have the economic sanctions imposed by the United States and other countries after repeated violations of human rights, connections with kleptocratic networks, and the dismantling of democratic institutions. Given the economic, social, political, security crisis in Venezuela under Maduro, the government has used food and medicine supply to buy support and ruling by repression. So while this had been the domestic picture in Venezuela, power dynamics on the global stage have also changed. We no longer live in an unipolar world with only one big, powerful political, military, and economic power. Rather, we have witnessed for some years now a struggle between various great and middle power countries that are making their way to becoming the most powerful at the international level. And the best example of that is China. Populists in Venezuela and other latitudes have endorsed international alliances and collaborations if those collaborations represent counter-hegemonic or defensive projects like the one that was laid out by Hugo Chavez. How exactly have this global powers dynamics and the international context help authoritarian populism in Venezuela, and how that had been important to move from a radical populism in Venezuela to the authoritarian populism we see today with Nicolás Maduro? Well, first, Chavez's populist rhetoric pledging to improve the quality of democratic participation and representation, the national struggle to bring social justice and counterbalance the hegemonic power of the US helped Chavez to connect with a sector of the population inside of Venezuela, but also with people around the world, including people in other parts of Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The ideological differences that separated people in Venezuela and between Chavez and the opposition not only represented clear ideological divergences on national policies, but also international allies. Second, using ballots, constitution making to bring change and personalistic approaches also helped Chavez gain support at the domestic level. But at the international level, his anti-Western and anti-liberal rhetoric helped him gain support from other leaders who, even when they were or are not leftist, like is the case of Vladimir Putin, still brought support to the regime in Venezuela and have been key for the survival of Maduro. Today, polarization is not only a domestic issue, as well as populism is not only a domestic issue. It is also an international one that has benefited populists in promoting their agendas and consolidating their power in their countries. And the third point here is that in the particular case of Venezuela, the wide range of its international corporations includes not only a variety of regimes that are anti-liberal, but also anti-West. They have also provided different means to the regime of Maduro, a regime that has been sanctioned and has become more isolated by giving financial aid to Maduro, military aid, diplomatic exposure, surveillance technology, and identification control, among other help. All this in conjunction and in the context of a Venezuela facing economic and social turmoil has been important for the regime to survive. So due to time issues, of course, I'm not delving into how countries like, for example, Cuba, Iran, Turkey, Russia, or China have helped Maduro, but I have listed some of that help here. As you can see, not every single country have provided exactly the same help to Nicolás Maduro, but in ways, each of them has contributed not only to support Maduro, but for Maduro to actually remain in power and to enact his authoritarian policies within Venezuela. There are three general points I want to make here that connect to others' presentations and, of course, with the Venezuelan case. One is that as much as the concept of populism has been a contested one for many reasons, it is difficult to separate populism from democratic backsliding in the case of Venezuela. Today, authoritarian populism in the country is a consequence of both populism and that democratic backsliding we saw in the mid-2000s. I'm highlighting this and the fact that authoritarian populism came after democratic backsliding, since not always authoritarianism is possible or happens after democratic backsliding. Second, left populists in Latin America, as Carlos de la Torre claims, don't support views of populism as a democratizing phenomenon. Rather, their record in the region suggests they're persistent in undermining democratic foundations in countries where perhaps it was actually possible to move towards a better democracy, such as the case of Venezuela. I think this is also true for right-wing populists in Latin America. As Julio Carrión mentioned earlier, the path seen in Venezuela is that of an unconstrained populism that unfortunately led to a regime change that, rather to becoming more democratic, became more authoritarian. And finally, we tend to think about populism in terms of political, economic, social, or even discourse terms. Yet we tend to disregard in the study of populism and authoritarian populism how actually international or global dynamics enhance or not that populism. And worse yet, how those international dynamics increase the chances of giving support and a chance for populist dictators to survive. And that is precisely the case of Venezuela. Chavez used populist rhetoric. He used populism as a political strategy to consolidate his power. But also we need to keep in mind that the international context also helped Chavez not only to seek to amplify his international allies and international corporations, but for these allies to later on actually help Maduro to survive in power. Given the economic situation in Venezuela, it is almost impossible for Maduro to survive without having the means to keep social spending high or to redistribute resources to those that are part of the regime. So given these alliances, given the fact that we know that the United States is the big evil for Venezuela, now Venezuela is turning to China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Cuba to, again, remain in power. And given that populist leaders are actively engaging in various forms of international cooperation, I think it is relevant and important then to understand how these international dynamics, again, play a role in consolidating authoritarianism and populism in various parts of the world. So with that, I'm finishing my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you very much for that. Next, we have Libertarian Populism, Making Sense of Javier Milei's Discourse, presented by Drs. Reinhard Heinisch and Andres Laguna Tapia. Floor is yours. I don't know if you're going to take turns. Just a reminder, 10 minutes with an additional 5 minutes. Are you both presenting?
We're both presenting. I'm starting, and then Andres will take over essentially.
Okay.
Andres, can you perhaps share the screen? I seem to have difficulties doing that.
There's no problem. Give me a second. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, wonderful. So
That's perfect.
First of all, let me thank you, Bolen, for the invitation. I want to thank the center, and I want to acknowledge the co-authors. So obviously Andres, Oscar Garcia Laneta, and Claudia Muriel Quintanilla. My name is Reinhard Heinisch from the University of Salzburg. If you turn, please. So if we look at Milei, essentially you're aware that Milei has been an extremely controversial politician in Argentina. He's caused quite a ruckus. He's presented himself as a consummate outsider, as an anti-politician. He calls himself a loco, wielding the chainsaw, living with the clone dogs, and sort of presenting himself as a charismatic anti-establishment figure. So therefore, if you could turn, please. So therefore, our research question is, how do we classify Milei in terms of populism, and which theory of populism is best equipped to explain what kind of populist he is? So why does this matter? Well, first of all, Argentina is a really important, influential country with, as you well know, we've mentioned this today various times, long populist legacy. Milei is often likened in the media to Trump and to other international populists. A recent piece of research that came out in Comparative Politics in January calls him a partial populist. And if you look at Milei's own political philosophies, he self-identifies as a liberal libertarian, and he himself labels the previous governments populist. So all that raises the questions of what is he really? And can you be a populist if you're a libertarian, given that populists, as we've heard many times today, construct a collective, conceptualize the people? While here we have someone who actually does the opposite. He advocates a belief system that is sort of the combination of individualism and individual liberty. So all this raises questions about, okay, how do we make sense of his discourse, and what is he really, and what is a partial populist? We could move to the next slide. So what we've done is, so we tried to look at that empirically by looking at his discourse. We're trying to analyze just his discourse, not his politics nor his policy. We're looking at this from three important approaches to populism, three important theories. So we first of all look at ideational populism, Moody and others. We've talked about it today. Sort of the classic, the society is divided into two homogeneous groups, the people, the elites, and the sort of Manichaean dimension, this binary dimension. Then we look at this from the perspective of Asanides' famous article, Populism is a Discursive Frame. So based on Laclau's two criteria, the construction of the people and an equivalential antagonistic group, and then also the idea that in this discourse you have a diagnostic essentially framing, you have prognostic framing, and you have moral framing, and moral framing for the purpose of radical change, where the populist leader comes in to save the people from the antagonists. And then thirdly, we've also mentioned Wayland, is populism as a strategy. So populism is seen as a strategy where a personalistic leader sort of seeks to appeal directly to a public, bases its power on the direct, unmediated, and non-institutionalized support of a large number of unorganized followers, essentially a people that rises up and plays a historical role and brings about change. And the leader here, and we read Wayland, sort of often you have Fukimori as sort of the figure here, so that the populist is essentially opportunistic, takes advantage of different contextual changes. There are often sudden turnarounds, but he's often contextually driven and is responsive in order to cling or realize power, achieve power, cling to power. Or, and that's the last theory we've looked at, is Ben Moffitt, who sort of looks at populism as the ability to build a power discourse around the idea of crisis. Sort of, the idea here is essentially that while crises exist, but crises always have to be mediated, they have to be communicated through performance, through mediation. And here the key is that a populist will use the crisis and say connect economic issues or natural disaster to people's values, norms, and prejudices in order to link it to something larger. To identify the culprits, the ones responsible for it, but crisis-based populists do not construct a people. The people are essentially the victims of the crisis, and the crisis perpetrated by the elites and by those who were identified as sort of nefarious. And in performing crisis, in this case, the crisis is generally linked to something broader, something larger, and is suffused with a strong moral dimension. And populists continue to propagate crisis as something that pertains to them. Our empirical strategy, therefore, is we've collected a large range of speeches by Millet. We've also collected his social media posts on Facebook and on Twitter, and we've constructed a coding scheme, and we've applied them, and we continue to, this is very much work in progress, and we've continued to apply here, where we essentially try to see what can we find, what is sort of the core in these speeches from the beginning and all the way to the campaign, all the way to the first few months in office, speeches that are both directed to different audiences and that are different or interviews that he gives, to identify sort of the common core, and then scrutinize these speeches based on these different theories. We've identified key indicators in these different theories and try to, in order to see what fits better. And now turning over to Andres.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. Of course, for understanding the rise of Millet, we had to check out the roots of populism in Argentina. Most, I'm going to say, it is going to be obvious for most of you, but I think it is very important to say that in general for Latin America, and especially us as Bolivians, populism in Latin America is of course a large theme, and Argentina was very influential in all the region, and especially the populist discourse in Argentina is very unique and very influential for us. So that's why it was interesting for us to study, Millet and in general Argentinian populism. We divided, and I think most of historians divided the Argentinian populism in three phases. 1940s, 50s, the classical phase, the neo-populists from the 80s and 90s, of course, with the great figure or the main figure of Menem, and the 21st century populism, the left-wing Kirchnerist populism that we already talked about it. And of course, the notable leaders of these movements are Perón, that was mentioned before, Menem and the Kirchners, of course. So Perón is the quintessence of populism, of Argentinian populism, of course. So probably is the figure that we are going to check to compare other populists, and I think that's very, very important for us too. And of course, frequently Milei claims himself as an anti-Peronist, but also he says that the best president ever was Menem, so who was a Peronist. So it is very interesting to see this paradoxical discourse that always we see in Milei. So yeah, I think I don't want to talk longer about Perón because I think it is well known. But of course, the figure of Kirchner is very interesting, and Cristina Fernandez. I really like to use this image of El Eternauta, the popular graphic novel, using Kirchner as a figure, as a very popular figure, and of course as an emblem of populism in Argentina. Of course, in our paper, in our research, we try to explain this rise of Milei, and it is very important to talk about the economical movement and the crisis. Of course, 2001 crisis is very important to understand this phenomenon, and Milei always do a comparison with Kirchneristas government and the moment of crisis. So it was very important. So in our paper, we made an abstract of the different economical moments in Argentinian history. So especially for somebody who uses a discourse full of technicisms in economy, I think it's very important to understand that. So yeah, of course, and I think everybody knows that the crisis of the beginning of 2000s, it is very important. It is explained by the neoliberal policies in the 90s, and of course the crisis after. In the last years, it is very important to explain the rise of a disruptive discourse in Milei. So yeah, so I think that's key. So we made also like a little analysis of the context of the presidential elections, and I think at the beginning, it was a surprise that Milei won. So I think nobody was expecting that, at least to be the first one. So in that moment, I think we find in the analysis of this discourse how his discourse changed. So I think it is. We think that it is very important that in the political landscape, the first round was very important to the change of discourse of all the candidates. Bullrich became like much more moderate. Milei also. So it was very, very interesting. And Massa, of course, didn't have the capability of mobilize feelings in the voting people. So I think that was very important. And we find a change of discourse, and I think that we can explain the rhetoric of the candidate in that moment, and I think that's very important. And of course, the victory, and something that everybody knows, but maybe Reinhard can talk a little bit more deep into that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Andres. So if we were to hold up our four theories to the discourse and the election campaign that Andres just described, if we first look at ideation of populism, what is quite interesting, and that's sort of the conclusion that also the other publication in Contemporary Politics came to, is that he doesn't talk much about the people. He talks about los argentinos de bien, the good Argentinians. His heroes are taxpayers, hardworking people, but it's sort of like the way most conservative politicians in countries talk about the people. But he doesn't really construct a people in that sense. And in the text that we see, if we analyze this paragraph-wise, we find 2 to 3% of the paragraphs actually talk about the people. However, he spends a lot of attention defining the enemies, the elites, and he uses very strong language to do so. He uses very emotive language to do so. When it comes to sort of binary view of the world, he doesn't quite do that either, but he does clearly suffuse his discourse with a lot of moralizing. There's clearly a moral duty involved here. When it comes to a host ideology, the host ideology that he has is sort of libertarianism, if you will, and that's a major issue, and he's been pretty consistent about this. And he brings it in various ways, and he talks about this in almost quasi-religious terms. So, but if you come to this from an ideational populist perspective, Millet doesn't quite fit the ideational pattern, and therefore I think it is not super helpful if we wanted to understand it. If we now could move on, for example, to the next slide, that would be. Yeah, so they just simply see here. So we look at the discursive framing, Aslanidis. Discursive and ideational populism both have the same problem that, again, the people are not really fully defined. We do find evidence of a lot of diagnostic framing. So he is very thick on the diagnosis. And he's not so forthcoming on the prognosis. I mean, he does talk about what he wants to change, and he's clearly able as an economist to give very sophisticated arguments, but if pressed what he means by dollarization, what he means by changes that he wants to, how he wants to affect the central bank, he tends to talk in generalities, and he tends to be rather quiet about the actual effects this would have on voters. So he's hedging his bets. He does, on the other hand, again, talk about moral urgency, but he fails to satisfy, if you will, Laclau's 2 criteria, because again, he doesn't really talk much. He doesn't construct an Argentine people or the real Argentinians or the people he wants to rescue. The people are simply the people who are suffering from the Kirchnerists, essentially. If we then move on to Wayland and the idea of populism as a strategy, here that is super interesting approach. My own problem that I've always had with the approach for populism as a strategy, and I think it's in the next slide, for populism as a strategy, when does a strategy become populist, and when is a strategy political? I mean, all politicians are strategic, and Millet, of course, is strategic. So in the early part of the campaign, he needs to distance himself from fellow conservatives, from Macri and Macristas, and he tends to attack the people that are closer to him. In the second part, he attacks Massa, the representative of the official of the government, and he is clearly wooing those voters. So he's strategic. But I don't see much evidence, or we don't see much evidence, at least in the discourse at first, that he's trying to appeal directly to the unorganized masses, and he considers the people in the street to be sort of a transcendental force. He's more or less saying, vote for me, I'm the change agent, and I can bring about change. Now, we'll see whether that will change now that his agenda is stalled in Congress. He's talked recently about the plebiscite, and that may change as he finds it difficult to get his agenda through the institutions. He may seek a way around the institutions, but that wasn't part of our analysis. In our analysis, he has given us less evidence of that. And then moving on to the last slide, or the last theory, the idea would be performing crises. And we do find quite a bit of that essentially in that approach, the people are defined as all those who are suffering from the victims of the crisis. And Millet does this all the time. He stresses, of course, immediacy and the decisiveness of action, Argentina is in grave peril. It is irreversible if we don't act very quickly. He talks about the crisis in the most extreme terms. He talks about his enemies in the most extreme term. He links the crisis to a moral question. He links it to something broader, that the world is under siege by the collectivists. It's the battle. He talks about the cultural battle we have to wage every day. So he does clearly do a performance where he builds a strategy around the perception of the crisis. And he clearly has done that as well to bringing new kinds of voters. So if I wanted to conclude, essentially, if we try to understand Millet in his totality from the different perspectives, the idea of performing crises, the theory by Ben Moffitt, that he's used to explain also figures like Trump and Erdogan and others, seems to apply reasonably well to at least the discourse of Millet. And if you see on the last slide, essentially that ideational populism and discourse seem to leave us wanting for more. Strategy, in my view, doesn't apply as well either to that, but that the idea of crisis and a discourse constructed around the mediation of crisis seems to be a very solid explanation in order to explain where Millet is coming from. And with that, I want to thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. We are ready for the final presentation with Dr. Victor de Oliveira Pinto Coelho. He will be talking about the phenomenon of Bolsonarism in Brazil, specificities, and global connections. The floor is yours. 10 to 15 minutes. Okay?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Bullich. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will try to share my slides. 1 minute. And sorry, because I had technical problems to entry in the Zoom. Because of that, I was 1 minute. Okay. So my colleagues previous talking about some topics of my presentation, and I think I could be faster than I have planned before. So I see populism an internal phenomenon in democracies with a representative liberal political system that is not an external threat, as the liberal media often makes it seem. Populism arises, to put succinctly, when there is an accumulation of popular demands resulting from the failure to be serviced by the state and formal institutions. This accumulation of dissatisfaction can be mediated institutionally through political parties and parliamentary agreements, or it can be galvanized by popular movements or by populist leaders or populist movements. So, conceptualizing populism. Populism has, in general, three characteristics that have already pointed by my colleagues. First of all, from a political point of view, the proeminence of the charismatic leader, and the principal point to understand Bolsonaro is that he presents himself as an authentic popular leader and make his leadership as a challenge, at least declared, to what he defines as the status quo. Second point, from a discursive or ideological point of view, the emphasis on a fundamental antagonism that divides society between us, the people, and then the privileged and corrupt elite. And third, from an institutional point of view, the always tense relationship between populism and the democratic, liberal, and representative system. So I also use the theoretical mark of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. For me, the principal point is that the division us versus them, or people versus elite, does not have a prior foundation in a specific class or social group. And this us versus them polarity is built around an empty signifier, which manages to unify the demands into a common problem. At the same time, is building the image of the opponent. An example, in Brazil, we have the case of the motto of fight against corruption. And I will explain this by talking about a political event that, for me, has fundamental importance for the subsequent strand of Bolsonarismo in Brazil, the Lava Jato operation. Operação Lava Jato is the name for a set of investigation carried out by the federal police from 2014 onwards, an operation commanded by the Federal Public Ministry based in the city of Curitiba. This operation aimed to investigate a money laundering and bribery scam. Its main target was leaders of the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the Workers' Party, and large companies. As already has been proven, the Lava Jato operation was fraudulent because it involved a partnership between prosecutors and the judge Sérgio Moro. Inspired by the money political operation that previously occurred in Italy, it strategically used media and sensationalist actions to produce a prior disposition in public opinion to consider the guilt of people accused of crimes. Thus, there was immense publicity for cases involving corruption allegations. The fight against corruption became a floating signifier, being linked to right-wing political positions. It thus became a pole around which two chains of equivalents were constituted. On the one hand, negatively, we have the supposedly bloated and inefficient state serving as a machine for clientelism and corruption. The defense of the state was pointed out a policy of the political left in the interests of unions, etc. And one of the forms of clientelism would be social income transfer policies, which would serve to discourage people from working more and exchange of favors, therefore, between ignorant people and a corrupt state. On the other hand, positively, we have the fight against corruption as a defense of a minimal state, of exaltation of entrepreneurship in the market, these things being considered synonymous with freedom. Ideologically, there was a good receptivity on the part of the Brazilian corporate media. With Bolsonaro and Bolsonarismo from 2017 onwards, this polarization was accentuated. Firstly, Bolsonaro brought back the anti-communist ideology, typical of the Cold War, and which, on the eve of the 1964 military coup, linked the left-wing government to cases of corruption. Bolsonaro has always defended the military dictatorship as the guardian of the country against the red threat. According to defenders of the dictatorship, at the time, there was not corruption. It was remembering that due to the absence of transitional justice in Brazil, several military personnel, such as Bolsonaro, trained during the dictatorship, were able to participate in this government. More than that, both Bolsonaro and his vice president, General Hamilton Mourão, publicly defended the torture Carlos Brilhante Ustra. Not only were they not punished, but their candidacies were confirmed. In other words, here we have a continued failure in the construction of a historic memory about the dictatorship. This is a very important point to understand the Brazilian political context. When President Dilma Rousseff, Lula's successor, implemented the National Truth Commission in 2012, this caused a spirit of revolt among military groups who left betrayed. despite the fact that the Commission did not presuppose any type of punishment for former torturers and murderers. Secondly, one of the main bases of support for Bolsonaro is made up of a group of Christian churches, especially evangelical and new Pentecostal churches, but also conservative Catholic groups. Here, the fight against corruption was embraced in two senses. First, the defense of entrepreneurship as a path to individual redemption through work. There was a boost in the country of the theology of prosperity and even the theology of dominion. In the late case of the theology of dominion, there is an intense and unconditional defense of the flag of Israel, which predates the current genocidal expansion on the Palestinians. The second characteristic of the Christian push towards political polarization, which took place around the theme of fight corruption, is the cultural war. For Christian political leaders, just like in the USA, the left wing is synonymous with moral depravity, that is, gender ideology, gay dictatorship, cultural Marxism, etc. Left-wing ideology is against family values. Thus, fighting corruption is also a moral fight. Well, for us, it would be very easy to classify such motivations as the result of ignorance, especially since we are in a time of internet, the social networks, and the logic of bubbles or echo chambers, a time of manipulation of algorithms and fake news. I am not saying we should ignore such things, but I think that analyzing the Bolsonarist phenomenon only through this approach is a risk of underestimating people's ability to identify the problems and demands, a risk of overlooking the fact that the people often define their political choices seeking maximum coherence between the evaluation of given lives and political possibilities. I believe this is the problem with historian João César de Castro Rocha analysis, which have been gaining a lot of attention. His analysis of what he calls cultural war and hate rhetoric and his concept of cognitive dissonance are in fact relevant. But the author has been vindicating old theories of the irrational popular masses, because in his analysis, there is no space for social criticism in the perception of the real complexity for the political dispute. I wanted to point out here that as much as we hate it, phenomena like Bolsonarism are not apolitical or anti-political. We must not confuse institutional politics within the framework of representatively liberal democracy with the political phenomenon in general. Bolsonarism, from both an electoral point of view and from the point of view of the mobilization, engagement, and passion, is a political phenomenon. It can only be considered anti-political to the extent that, like all far-right populism, it aims to eliminate or instrumentalize institutional form of mediation. In other words, attacks on state institutions and traditional media are accompanied by supposedly direct communication between leadership and the people. In this regard, social networks on the internet have, in fact, been make a great contribution. I suggest, in the case of Bolsonarism, the research of anthropologist Letícia Cesarino. Another anthropologist, Rosana Pinheiro Machado, has also been producing very important studies on the recent contest. She recognizes that the main emotions that drive Bolsonarism are anger and frustration. However, it shows that such feelings are in relation to a moment of crisis and broken expectations. The governments of Lula and Dilma left as a legacy a growth in income and consumption for popular classes, which at time of failing growth rates encourage more demands for public service, urban mobility, health, education, housing, etc., This was the spirit of the street movements in 2013. From 2014 onward, however, I pointed out, political agendas began to be co-opted by the motto of fight against corruption, which would turn against the PT Workers' Party governments. At this point, I highlight another factor left out of the analysis that aimed to explain Bolsonarism as something simply the result of manipulation and disinformation. That is, the depolitization carried out by the institutional left, especially the Workers' Party itself. In other words, in addition to the problem of the political crisis that arose between 2013 and 2014, there was an exclusive focus on social measures carried out by the state. The problem is that such measures were tied to an economic boom cycle that predictably would not last long, having been based mainly on the export of commodities. There was, for example, no satisfactory investment in science and technology, while the country suffered, in relative terms, a process of deindustrialization. Traditional social movements traditionally linked to the Workers' Party, such as the Landless Workers Movement and the Insigo Workers Central, preferred accommodation with the government policies. Finally, the government, in party's communication with the population, was limited to passivity with the media, accommodation with limited economic growth, and the encouragement of consumer citizenship. This emphasis on consumer citizenship was so central that even the idea of social justice was held hostage by economic indices, increased consumption, and income transfer programs. In addition, the institutional left wing left the issue of public security in the hands of the right. Being in power, including the states of the federation, the left wing reproduced the punitive model based on the war on drugs, which has been producing mass incarceration and proliferation of drug factions. The left wing did not have the capacity to produce an authentic national economic development plan, which was not dependent on the commodity export model. This last point is a vicious cycle. The Agricultural Congress bloc is one of the strongest in the National Congress and remains strong and influential as long as it maintains its influence on the economic policies of the executive power. The philosopher Vladimir Safatli recently gave an interview that caused a great repercussion because he declared that the left wing is dead in Brazil. He noticed that the Bolsonarist extremely right continues quite active and mobilized, while the left wing, once again in power, once again proposed a management pact of the formal institutional system and the capitalist economy. My point is there was a gap between the constitutional promises and the reality of the production of inequality by capitalism. So far, I have highlighted the aspect of Bolsonarism with a view of the national context. However, some of these elements that I pointed out already concern global connections. From the point of view of the dynamics of the movement, Bolsonarism corresponds to characteristics that are seen in all far-right populist movements: leadership that claims to be an outsider, polarizing language, attack the instance of mediation in favor of communication perceived as direct between leader and followers. From an instrumental point of view, the same opportunistic use of social networks on the internet. Furthermore, such strategies took place together with effective transnational alliances, such as, for example, the Bolsonaro family's contact with Steve Bannon, the Donald Trump strategy. Bolsonaro contributed to the creation of an international conservative alliance approaching governments such as those in Hungary and Poland. From the point of view of our historical context, we have the crisis of representation linked to a crisis of a social and economic nature that has worsened since 2008. I would like to highlight here that in the neoliberal context, we have a tendency of continuous economic contraction of the middle classes, in addition to the general increase in economic inequality. In the case of Brazil, although the year 2014 did not yet present a major economic crisis, on the other hand, there was a tragic effect of one of the PT government's positive policies. Young people from lower classes who started attending university, at the moment they obtained the diploma, they already encountered a deregulated job market and low-paying jobs. This occurred especially in the southeast and south regions of the country, while income transfer policies had a greater positive effect in the northeast, a region where Lula continued to have a proportionally greater prestige. To conclude, I intend now to highlight a very important point which the Bolsonarist phenomenon can help clarify to us. Neoliberalism has broken new forms of subjectivation. The absence of public and labor policies is accompanied by praise for entrepreneurship, which in turn is synonymous with freedom and individual capacity. No wonder in Brazil, Bolsonarism has become attractive even to people from lower social classes, already accustomed to be absent to the absence of the state in their lives, apart from the presence of the policies. So the populist phenomenon, I say now to conclude, returning to the beginning of my speech, is not an external threat to the liberal system in the capitalist mode of production, by a symptom of the crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Before we start the Q&A session, I'll just remind you that you can use the raise your hand. And I think I will keep the order much better if I have the hands right there. So we can start with Manuel Rocha.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Hello. I will do my best to convey my argument in English, so I can do the question?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I have a naive question. Isn't the cultural legacy of the Anglo-Saxon world the precursor of populist parties? Let us remember that democracy is a legacy of the Anglo-Saxon world, a culture that is governed by Judeo-Christian principles, that after the historical process of Renaissance are based on the idea that every human being is equal. For example, this can clearly be seen in what is called secular religion, where due to the Judeo-Christian heritage, it always needs a devil, another, otro, un diablo, to answer and wield power. So the legacy of Judeo-Christian principles inherits the need in nations and in human groups to seek antagonistic narratives. That is, as a conclusion, triggers populist action. So, I'm repeating myself, isn't the cultural legacy of the Anglo-Saxon world the precursor of populist parties?
Before we move on, first, I would appreciate if you keep your questions short. But the other is, if you have in mind who is going to respond to your question, you can identify the speaker. Okay, so we'll just go on this first round. Everybody, make your questions, and let's move on with Dr. Reinhard Heinisch.
Hi, thank you so much. I have three questions. First question to Julio. I wanted to ask you, Julio, with your conception of constrained, unconstrained populism, the way you come to this, do you think this is something we know beforehand, so we can use this as predictive, Or do you then evaluate this afterwards that you see this is a case of constrained or unconstrained populism, and therefore you explain as ex post fact? That would be wonderful. The second question I have is for Ariadna. I'm just curious, in your case, could you maybe explain again the international dimension of populism by Chavez? Do you see that as populist, or do you see a populist who's simply using an international strategy? Or do you claim that building an international alliance is inherently something populist, or is this simply an international strategy of a populist who's a populist in Venezuela? And lastly, for Victor, the last speaker, I was just curious if he had data or evidence about the claims that the consumerist attitudes that the people have towards him, and what he bases his analysis on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. One more we're going to take from Esteban Davis Amaya. You're muted if you're speaking.
Thank you. I apologize. Thank you very much, everyone. It was really interesting. I have a question which can be open to anyone in the panel, and I actually may be wrong with the premise of my question. But it would seem to me that most of these populist leaders have left power in fairly peaceful ways, and that have not used conflict, especially international conflict, not internal, but international conflict, as a way to remain in power. Of course, we still have both Maduro and Ortega in power, and Maduro has suggested some sort of international conflict. But if we, for example, compare it to populists, like Putin as a populist, for example, it would be very, very different, that use of international conflict. So I was wondering whether I am correct in assuming this, or and what your views are on it. Thank you.
Okay, since Manuel Rocha didn't identify a speaker, I would ask Dr. Monk, would you like to respond to his question? Or any other? I don't know.
Yeah, well, let someone else try first.
Okay.
But I still need to go back on what I was left with earlier, if you remember.
Okay.
When I was cut off.
I can offer a half a minute reply to that question.
Okay.
We have populism everywhere, in every single continent and under every single cultural tradition. So no, I will not equate populism as a legacy of the what it was, the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is more of a political practice found everywhere. There are places where the terrain is more fertile, like in Latin America, and where it's less fertile, I would say, like Africa or parts of Asia, but you can identify populist leaders, movements, ideologies everywhere.
So now that we have you, would you respond to Dr.
Yes. I'll be more than happy. And I'm very grateful for that question, because precisely goes to the heart of my theory, right? I make the point that precisely we cannot tell ahead of time, ex ante, what variety of populism in power is going to develop, precisely because it's going to be the product of the political process that is going to emerge as the result of the populist leader trying to aggrandize his or her power. And that's why I will say it's a situation that we can determine ex post rather than ex ante, right? It's very interesting, for instance, in the case of the United States, when Trump shut down the federal government as an effort to force Congress to pass his budget that will fund significantly his infamous border wall. That was, a 3-week shutdown of the federal government that he lost. He lost significantly. And then the congressional elections a few months later, his party lost the majority in the Senate. So those were the results of political processes that significantly undermine his ability or his capability of aggrandizing power in the way that he certainly wanted to. He just couldn't. But also because there were no permissive conditions available to him like there were in other cases. Like he did not have the 90% popularity approval that somebody like Bukele has today. He was barely in the mid-30s, and there was no collapse of the traditional party system. Still, the Democratic Party was not only strong, but it was able to contest the dominance of the Republican Party in both houses of Congress. So yeah, unconstrained populism is something that we can tell after the outcome of a major political confrontation that is going to occur once the president or the populist leader tries to upset the status quo.
Okay, next we have Adriana. Would you like to respond to?
Yes, actually, I want to address Reinhard and Steven's great questions about the international dimension of populism. I think that Reinhard was asking about the international dimension, whether building alliances is actually a populist strategy of, in the case of Hugo Chavez. I mean, creating corporations and alliances is not necessarily a populist thing, right? In international relations, you are constantly, whether you are a populist or not, creating, cooperation with countries that are going to benefit your economy or are going to benefit, your political goals, right? The point that I'm trying to make here is that contrary to other precedents that we have seen in Venezuela, Chavez used those corporations, the international dimension as a way to also divide people into us versus them, right? And so in that way, not only he seek for extremely tight cooperations with Cuba, with China, with Russia, with Belarus, because not only they were similar regimes to him, but also because they share something that was relevant in that populist strategy or discourse that he also used at the domestic level, which is we have been oppressed for many years, for many decades by the US. We have been imposed liberal policies, liberal strategies that have not benefited the excluded, right? So we have a group in Venezuela that have been excluded, that have been the poor, but also that discourse, that distinction was used at the international level. Who are the poors? The poors are in Africa, the poors are in Asia, the poors are in the Middle East, because the US have been an hegemonic power that has done everything possible to increase that power at the international level. So going back to your question, no, I mean, definitely building alliances is not a populist thing per se. But in the case of Chavez, it was a strategy not only to seek for expanding alliances that later on Maduro is going to use to survive in power, but also because he used a populist strategy and a populist discourse, not only at the domestic level, but at the international level, to divide countries, to divide the global north or the global south, or use the distinction that you want to use, right? Those that have been oppressed versus those that have great power. But also going to the question of Esteban and conflict, usually in international relations, you're going to find people that perceive conflict as always when we use arms. And conflict not always means using arms. Conflict not always means using military officers, right? If you look at what, for example, Hugo Chavez did in foreign policy, he was in a constant conflict with the United States, even when, of course, they were not using, arms and they were not using officers. Also, you're going to see that the Chavez also was in constant conflict with regional organizations like in other countries in Latin America that were not aligned to the Bolivarian revolution or socialism, right? So conflict is not something that we need to think about in terms of armed conflict, but also conflict when, for example, you cut relationships with another regime just because they are not aligned in political terms with you, right? And so you're right, they have leave power in a peaceful way. I don't know if cancer in Chavez was not there in 2011, he will still the president in Venezuela. I think he will be still the president of Venezuela. Who knows, right? But also we know that with Nicolas Maduro, passing the fact that Chavez died in 2013, Maduro also has used conflict somehow to also align himself with those that are going to benefit him in surviving in power. And that has meant being allies with China, even if selling oil at a very low price is going to lead to that. It's also getting military aid from Russia. It's also getting, bank accounts in Russia rather than having them in other parts of the world. So there are ways that, which is my claim here, there are ways how populists like Chavez and, of course, Maduro have used at the international level for them to survive, but also to change the regime. And that's why we see authoritarian populism in Venezuela. So your question is, yes, they have lived power peacefully for the most part, but also we have seen conflictual rhetoric and conflictual relationship when it comes to Maduro and Chavez, because they have used that conflict not only to make a point of their leadership in the case of Chavez, but also to align themselves with those that are with them versus those that are against them at the international level.
Okay, the following question is the one for Victor Coelho. From Heinisch, Dr. Heinisch. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the question, or do you want
to? Yes,
okay.
If I understood the question, thank you, Heinisch. The question is about consumer citizenship. I think is that. So Dilma Rousseff herself, namely the people from C and D classes, this is a classification from Brazil, C and D classes that got income increase during the governments, PT governments. Dilma Rousseff, namely these people, has new middle classes. And all the discussion made from the PT, government PT, was involved. Think like consumer, created more employed. It's okay, it's not a problem. But themes linked to the history of left struggle remained in the background. I'm referring here, for example, to a struggle for agrarian reform and taxes justice, the reform of the armed forces regiment, etc. I remember in the epoch of the PT government, we talking about these topics. The supporters of Lula and Dilma have said, you are dreaming of socialist revolution. So what this is pointed that namely a process of depoliticization. Okay, I don't know if I made myself clear. There is another question in the chat. Sorry, I can't pronunciate his name in my colleague, Professor Victor, about Bolsonaro banning from politics. I think, my friend, that Bolsonaro is going to be arrested, but the discussion here now is we think that Bolsonarism as ideology will survive to Bolsonaro. Okay, is the point now. Because Bolsonarism, the mobilization is very strong, and I think even with Bolsonaro arrested, the people will not want to demobilize it. Okay.
Great, thank you. So we have 3 more questions from our fellow Dr. Bulent Keynes. Do you want to address them? It's for Reinhard Heinisch and Andres Laguna Tapia. 3 questions. Would you like to address them?
Yes, thank you very much for these insightful presentations delivered by our respected panelists and discussions administered by Maria. Thank you very much. My questions are for Professor Renat Heinisch and Professor Andres Laguna Tapia. My first question is, how do you reconcile Millei's self-identifications as a liberal libertarian with the characteristics typically associated with populism or partial populism, particularly considering his focus on individual freedom and rejection of collectivist politics? And an extra question about this partial populism, I couldn't exactly understand what it means, because all populists sometimes full populist and sometimes more reasonable and follow reasonable policies. So how could we make that the differentiation about full-fledged populist and partial populist? My second question, given Milli's emphasis on the diagnostic and motivational framing in his discourse, do you believe he employs other populist frames besides anti-elitism, especially considering his alignment with libertarianism and echoes of conservative sentiments on certain issues? So it is a kind of dilemma. Third, how do you distinguish between strategic politics and populist politics, particularly considering Millei's use of personalistic leadership and aims to challenge established elites as a loco? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course, this is just my answer, and Andres, I think, may give a different answer. I think your questions make our case because you're actually supporting what we're trying to say. Researchers come to the conclusion he's a partial populist, and that may not make much sense as a concept. But what is a half populist? And that's precisely why we argue that these models, discursive model or the ideation model, don't help us very much, because you would come to the conclusion he's not a full populist because he only talks about the elites, and so he's an anti-elitist. Then we said, okay, what else can we use? Is there a model out there that we can sort of turn to? And in that sense, Moffat's approach of performing crises seems to be something we can apply, and that seems to work. Now, it could be that has also limitations, but we found it the best fit. I also agree with you on the strategy. I think I also have a hard time distinguishing when does a political strategy become populist. I mean, I would agree with you. So therefore, I think if you read research is coming out of Milley and the recent publication in contemporary politics, they actually come to the conclusion he's a partial populist, and I don't find that very satisfying. But he's clearly a phenomenon who uses populist frames in certain respects, and therefore we can't just say he's a conventional politician who is just an anti-elitist. There's clearly more to him, and he does borrow a lot of stylistic and rhetorical elements from the repertoire of populists. So therefore he is an oddball in that sense. But you're completely correct. If you're an arch individualist, you're going to have a hard time constructing a people and talk about collectives. But I think Andres may have a different take on some of this, because he pointed out in his talk, Milei, of course, is a product of a Peronist populist legacy in Argentina. So we can't pretend he has nothing to do with it in that sense.
Sorry, I was muted. Probably some things I'm going to tell you are not reflected in the paper. I've been thinking a lot of that. The first thing is, when I used to live in Argentina, I remember what I heard the definition of Peronism was to eat ravioli with your mother the Sundays. So being a Peronist is like a very complex and very difficult thing to Yeah, to frame. So, and I think, of course, as Reinhard just said, Millet has some heritage, especially of this use of emotions to mobilize people, and inherited from Peronism. So I think what defines him the most is the concept of he's paradoxical, he's contradictory constantly. So that's why it's so hard to define his discourse. But yeah, he's contradictory. He's a very liberal, and so sometimes he uses a rational arguments, but he's also emotional. And I think the key of his success is related to emotions. I think the big problem with Massa was that he didn't fulfill the emotional aspect of political campaign. So, but I think that there's something very important. Millet, I think he has a definition of people, but it's a negative definition. So he says that people are not kirchneristas. So the Argentinos de Bien are not kirchneristas. And of course, he doesn't say anymore, but I think if you know Latin American reality, that Argentinos de Bien means a lot of stuff, and I think you have like a classist and of course a racist definition in there. He doesn't say it explicitly, but I think he has a negative definition. The problem with a negative definition, what you are not, is that it's very hard to frame and to use, to understand. And I think for me that's what we really need to do with this analysis. We have to try to understand what this negative definition means and how we can operate it. And I'm sure we are very, very early to try to understand what type of populist Millet is. I think he's a new type. Maybe he's just a demagogue. But I think he has many characteristics. But in the evolution of the government and in the evolution of his discourse, we're going to find out more clearly what of populist he is. But yeah, these are like not very ordinate, not very clear reflections. But I think, yeah, I just wanted to share with you.
There's an additional question. It was from Inda, who had to go to another call. It's for Dr. Julio Carrion. It's right here in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, and if you would like to respond to it anyway.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. And it's the question of the role of the opposition in the evolution of populism in power, which is really a very interesting question. I mean, Laura Gamboa has published, a year ago, more or less, an interesting book precisely on that, and which I strongly recommend. But what I will add is that I argue that two critical conditions allow the emergence of populism or allow the election of a populist to power. One is mass political discontent, which is a different way of saying a crisis of political representation. And the second is elite disarray, the collapse of traditional party organizations, which is also associated with the crisis of political representation. But these critical antecedents are not dichotomous, meaning they are not either or, meaning they are present or they are absent, right? There are degrees of difference, and those degrees of difference have a causal effect on the ability that populist leaders have to enhance or aggrandize their power. For instance, in Colombia and in the United States, the opposition still had a significant political influence in and attraction to significant parts of the masses. Therefore, the populist leader had a much more restricted political space to aggrandize their power. Whereas in places like Peru, for instance, when Fujimori was elected, the political parties were completely in disarray. They collapsed. And it took about a decade until the opposition could rebuild itself with different candidates and along different platforms. So again, the role of the opposition has to be seen in dynamic terms. Now, the opposition has significant problems or obstacles or barriers or challenges when confronting populist leaders. First of all, many of them are discredited. They were the ones who had power before, and the reason why they are out of power is because people didn't like them, so they voted them out of office. Also, they have significant ideological and political differences. So the question of the unity of the opposition to confront populism is always a problem, like in the case of Bolivia. I mean, the fact that Evo Morales had to leave power in 2019 when he forced his electoral fraud was not driven by political parties of the opposition. It was a civil unrest. It was people who took to the streets and put him out. And so it's the opposition has significant challenges, but when they rally around a single candidate, they pose a significant threat to populism in power. That doesn't mean that they are going to triumph. I mean, look at what happened in Nicaragua in 2021 when the opposition started rallying around the figure of Cristiana Chamorro. Ortega was quite scared, and he thought, oh, I lost against her mother in 1990. I'm not going to lose against her in 2021, right? And he disqualified her and accused her of money laundering. So it is a variable. The role of the opposition under populism is a variable that depends on how discredited they are, how willing they are to come together, and what are the kind of political capabilities that they might have. Is it only influence in the media, or is also the ability to attract mass following, right? So that would be my general reaction.
Thank you very much. Now we have Bullet.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is also for Julio. I wonder about what determines the nature of populism as constrained or unconstrained institutions of the populist leader. I mean, the resilience of the institutions and the democracy, or the intentions of the populist leader. What determines the constrained and unconstrained nature of populism?
Yeah, that's good. I think it's a combination of the permissive conditions, but also the productive conditions, meaning it's both, right? The leader might have quite authoritarian predispositions, but if he or she is constrained by the strength of a judiciary, for instance, as in the case of Colombia, then that's it. There's not going to be a regime change. That's what is important. So I will put more emphasis actually on the strength of institutions rather than the design of the institutions, right? But also the willingness of the political actors, or the ability of the political actors to literally constrain the populist president. What happened in El Salvador with Bukele is very interesting. When he won the presidency for the first time, he didn't have a congressional majority. As soon as he got his congressional majority, which is a permissive condition, the support of the public, he moved immediately against the constitutional chamber of the Supreme Court to allow him to basically get rid of them, right? His allies passed a law in Congress to dismiss this constitutional chamber. And what did he do? He sent the police to basically remove them from the building where they were, even though that very constitutional chamber had declared that law unconstitutional. But those poor judges didn't have the police behind them. You know, those who were managing the police was Bukele. So, you know, the power of the state, what are you going to do, right? I mean, how are you going to confront people with guns when you only have the book of laws on your side? That's what I mean by the strength of the institution, because the Salvadorian constitution is pretty much, you know, it had all these check and balances and all of that. Bukele just trampled over them. And there was no significant power inside the country to prevent that from happening because he was quite popular. The opposition had lost congressional majority, and the legislature removed completely those judges that were opposing the aggrandizement of power in El Salvador.
We have another hand here. Sumaira?
Hi, I would like to ask a question to Dr. Heinisch and Tapia about whether or how the politics around religion affects Milei's discourse, particularly his leanings towards Judaism and the shift of foreign policy on Israel, how it was received by the people. Thank you.
Andres, do you want to go first and take it? I'd be happy to say something afterwards.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, no, I think, of course, it is not possible to explain Milei's phenomena without understanding what's happening in all the region for the beginning. So I think this position, for me, it is very hard to differentiate what is true and what is imposed in him, and I think some of his positions in international politics are related to differentiate him from Kirchnerismo, and I think that disruptiveness sometimes is a reaction to what preceded him, and to differentiate him from socialism from 21st century, as they call it. So I think his position with Israel has to do with that, also with a lot of lobbies in Argentina per se. I don't think there's one answer to this phenomena. It is multifactorial, and but I think it is very important how theatrical he is and how he needs to display this difference between him and the otherness that is Kirchnerismo, and I think yeah, that's very important. I think the key of his success is related to that theatricality, and but I don't know, Reinhard, what's your perception?
No, I think you've actually hit the nail on the head. It's you can look at it in two ways. I mean, we don't know him personally, and we cannot judge him to what extent these are genuine convictions. And my sense is he's so dedicated to this that there is clearly a part of it that's a conviction, but he does celebrate it extremely. So that's clearly also evident. And this is a bit odd because normally you would assume populists would pursue popular things, because he also has sort of attacked the Pope, or is it a discourse and where he was critical of the Pope, and he's gone out of his way to defend Israel and to take a position at a time when you would say politically it's not very expedient because you want to signal that you are presidential material.
So to have such an exposed position, normally we were surprised that populists would do that. But I think Andres has sort of given the answer. If you were looking for an explanation, it could be to draw a contrast that he's different from the previous two fronts in Argentina, the Kirchnerists and the anti-Kirchnerists, and to be sort of this other person to establish his otherness. Clearly, it helps him internationally. There's clearly that aspect to it, but I think it is probably a combination of defining himself as being different, personal conviction, and a way to align himself with international forces, where he wants to be on one side and where he sees Brazil and many other countries in the global south on the other side, and that sort of helps him pursue that identity and strengthen that.
Well, I think if there are no other questions, I think I can briefly share. Just we have a few minutes, so I'll briefly share that, as expected, this was a great conversation. We really had a very robust series of approaches and perspectives with interesting presentations like Dr. Ronaldo Monk's post-populism reference. And I thought it was a very good to spark a debate about the problem with alternability and continuity when it comes to populists in power. I thought that was really, at least that's what I would like to further discuss. And with Dr. Julio Carrion's excellent presentation based on his book, I think it's important to address the fact that sometimes when we talk about populism, the reality in Latin America is so complex. And I thought it was interesting when he was breaking down the definitions that we know about the discourse strategy, that worldview approach to what we understand populism is. And of course, this very critical aspect that we witness in Latin America when it comes to the unconstrained populism and how populism flourishes under power asymmetry. I was thinking, because of all the comments, I was thinking about recently Maduro not only banning the opposition's candidate Maria Corina Machado, but also calling for elections at a moment when the opposition is clearly not prepared to make a decision just right away. So that is the power asymmetry of unconstrained populism. So I thought that was a really enlightening, illuminating presentation. And with respect to my dear colleague and friend Adriana Bersner's global approach to the authoritarian notion of populism, I think she laid out extremely well, not just what Chavismo is, but how it is perceived beyond Venezuela. I think it was important for her to present this political construction of a Chavismo, not just as a political identity, but also as a tool for power consolidation, which is basically what Chavismo means. It's not a political subject alone. It's a way of perpetuating power, political power. So I thought that was interesting. And of course, her approach to authoritarian survival with this international alliance with China, Russia, among others, as an anti-Western axis. And with Dr. Heinisch and Dr. Laguna Tapia's very interesting presentation, I enjoyed it, especially because, as you mentioned, we don't really know much about Milei. And what we are gathering is based on a political campaign that now is being put to the test because of the delivery. Now, what are his policies like? And is that related to what his persona and all his campaign tried to build? So I thought this was interesting. The more prominent the financial and economic situation is, the more urgent for people to seek to a solution, regardless if this solution is going to make things worse. Que se vayan todos. Let's break all the, institutions, the system, but we need something, and we need something huge and big. So I think this is important. No specificities, no dense or robust political construction. It's pure rhetoric, probably, but that's what I take. And finally, Dr. Coelho's presentation, I think it's important. I think it's important for us to understand that Bolsonarism is not, a bug. It's not something weird or apolitical. This is a political expression, and we shouldn't underestimate not just Bolsonarism, but I saw it in general as a very broad presentation of introduction to a theme, which is that we are currently and continuously underestimating expressions, political expressions like Trumpism or Bolsonarism or Bucalism. And we are going to be surprised about not just the resilience and strength, but the penetration of these political expressions. So I thought that was a very thought-provoking conversation and presentation in general from all of our speakers. So I would like to leave it to Luca for the closing of the session. And thank you all for joining the panel and for the invitation. Thank you, Bulent.
Yes, let me echo that. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I thought it was great. Really, really insightful, really interesting perspectives on all of them. Thank you to our wonderful moderator for managing so well the entire session, and yes, just a great moderation in general. Thank you to the organizers. So again, yes, thank you, Dr. Kenneth. Great panel. And finally, thank you to all of you, the attendees, who made this panel interactive and contributed with your remarks, your questions, and really gave us a lot of food for thought. So mark your calendars for the next session. That is March 28th, and we will be discussing forces shaping populism, authoritarianism, and democracy in South Korea, North Korea, and Mongolia. We look forward to seeing you there, and thank you very much again for this great discussion. Have a good day.
Thank you all. Thank you.